Hi, this is Lee Glickenhaus. I'm going to do an editing guide for you on a photograph I took on the Brewster Flats on a late fall day. And as you can see on the screen, it was a pretty gloomy day. Before I begin, I want to just start with a couple basic things. First of all, this is my first one of these, so forgive me for any slip ups or stuff like that. Secondly, just to be clear, I am not a Photoshop wizard. I'm comfortable with it and I know some things, but I am far from an expert. What I do know is how to find a look that I like. And I admit that I use training wheels for that a fair amount. As we'll get into, I use some third party filters and plugins to help me get things that I might not have the skill to either visualize or execute on my own. That said, um, I'll also begin by saying that when I sit down in front of the computer, I do not necessarily have a master plan. I have a pretty good idea of where I want to go and what kind of look and feeling I'm hoping to create. But a fair amount of what happens next is serendipity. There are some things I do that are very clearly designed to accomplish a specific goal. But some of what I do, a non trivial amount of what I do, is trial and error, experimenting with different things, clicking back and forth, and deciding what works. So I say that only so that you'll take whatever I say with a grain of salt and use it if it's helpful. Otherwise, find your own way. My workflow is pretty consistent, although it does vary. And it's a sort of a three-way trip. I bring my photographs into Lightroom, and you can see on the screen now, this is this photograph as it was imported to Lightroom. It's a raw file, and it's kind of boring and flat and lifeless. I'm not going to walk you through all of the changes I make in Lightroom at the beginning because they're fairly minimal. I just try to, well, you'll see what I try to do. So this is as imported into Lightroom. Um, and this is after I've done some basic touch up. I usually start with the auto button just to get an idea of what Lightroom thinks it should look like. I never completely agree with it, but it gives me a sense of what's possible. And then I tinker and tweak to get things the way I want. So from Lightroom, one very important thing to begin with is that except for some very long exposure photography, I bracket all of my photographs. Every time I press the shutter, my camera takes 5 rapid sequence shots at a consistent aperture and separated by one shutter speed f-stop for each exposure. I do that for a number of reasons. One, to collect more data so that I can blend them and get even more control over shadows and highlights and things like that. But also because I shoot a lot of water that's moving, it gives me the ability to do some creative things. For example, if the base shutter speed is 125th of a second and a wave is coming in, that won't absolutely freeze it, but it will give it some sharpness and some definition. But 5 stops later, it's about a quarter of a second, and you'll begin to see that smooth, flowy look that water in motion has. And then in Photoshop or otherwise, I can blend them to give a creative look that captures the various looks of one wave over time in one image. So what I have done here, I have done to 5 images by getting the settings the way I like them on the first one and then just pasting those settings onto the next 4. I export them as Photoshop files, and then typically I import them into Aurora HDR, which is a Skylum product that does blending. And don't let the word HDR fool you. It has a bad reputation, and for good reason. But Aurora has a number of looks and presets, and I've set aside the ones that I think are the most suitable to the way I like things to look. And I just take a quick look at how the images look with many or most of those. And I will save a handful of them, unedited, unchanged, just to give me, again, different looks that I can work with. I never use anything in its entirety, but again, it exposes me to some interpretations of the photograph that I might not come to otherwise by myself. So what I do is I export them as Photoshop files. So the 5 files come out of Lightroom, they go into Aurora. I then save 6 or 8 examples of Aurora presets that I like, and I export them to my desktop as Photoshop files, and then I bring them into Photoshop. And here we are in Photoshop, and you can see the base layer down here. This is what came out of Lightroom. And what I do is I just work my way up. So this next layer is called Crispy Light, and it is one of the Aurora looks. Um, and actually, I thought this was a good starting point. It is definitely overcooked, uh, but it brings out a lot more detail, as you can see, a lot more color and tone. And I'm going to use 2 or 3 more of these. This one is called Mystique, and I exported it from Aurora at 70%. That's what that 70 means. And you can see I've dialed the opacity down quite a bit here. If I go up all the way, you can see that's way too blue, but I brought it down to here, and now it's beginning to look slightly more realistic, and the watercolor is a little more natural. One more, the bright exterior preset. I click in, and it's at 74%, and you can see that I've used a layer mask. This is without the layer mask, and I thought the color of the sand was not to my liking. Sand color is one of the most difficult things I have found about seascape photography. It's almost impossible to get it looking natural. But this I liked, again, to work with. And now the big glow. That's just something that's going to soften it up, as you will see. Soften that look, take some of the distracting details out of the water here and out of the clouds. I'll click before and after, fixes the colors a little bit, and brightens it up. And again, I've masked out some things. I thought the sky was too bright here, so I masked out part of the sky. And now we're beginning to layer it. And now I did something, it's a tool I use from time to time, and I learned it from watching Photoshop videos, YouTube videos. I'm going to scale things and make those rocks just a little bigger and a little more definition. And that is used with the edit. Edit, transform, scale. And all you do is select the area you want. So you select the area you want, like that. Edit, transform, scale, and then just drag those corners to make it as small or as large as you want. Move it where you want. Hit the return key, and there it is. I'm going to undo that, but that's how it's done. Give you an idea. And sometimes it can be useful if you have an element that's interesting, but is a little too small. And it also had this has the advantage, you can see the little distracting element over here in the side. By scaling it and moving it, that is dealt with. And now I use a tool that I admit I tend to use perhaps a little bit too much, which is motion blur. I find this water to be a distraction from the feel that I'm looking to create. It's not interesting enough as a wave, and it's not still enough as calm water with reflections. So I use motion blur a lot to soften the sky, give that nice streaked look to the water, and soften it down here. And I deliberately, as you can see here from the layer mask, I deliberately did not use the motion blur around the rocks to give it a feel of a natural water around the rocks, sort of pooling, and then perhaps flowing here. And now comes something I do for all of my photographs, which is color grading. And that is simply tinkering with various tools. I tend to use color lookups and gradient maps, which are both adjustment layers. Color lookups are here under color lookup, and gradient maps are here under gradient map. And I'll be doing a separate guide to discuss those. But this is before color grading, and that's after. It's not dramatic, but I've increased the color in the water a little bit to give it the feel of a little more sunshine, also on the sand and on the rock. So now it's just feeling a little bit like a warmer, sunnier day. And then I bring things into Luminar, which is also a Skylum tool. And unfortunately, I don't do this as a smart object because I hate working with smart objects. They slow down everything. So I can't show you exactly what I did in Luminar, but we will see this is before and this is after. Again, nothing dramatic, but you can see it's brightened up. There's a little more definition around the rocks. I added a little Orton effect, again, to soften things. You can see a softening in the water, a softening and a brightening in the sky. And now then I tinkered with the hue and saturation. Um, and you can do it by channel, and you can see that I brought the yellow down quite a bit. So this was how it was before, a little too yellow. And again, it's the sand color. And then when I take it down, it's subtle, and it may not transfer well to YouTube, but it made the sand more to my liking. I added a little vignette. And again, I have a bit of a training wheel here. It's sort of like Velcro shoe closures, right? There are many ways to do a vignette in Photoshop manually, the old-fashioned way. There are ways to do everything I have done here the old-fashioned way, and I have done them. But the third-party tools have become so good and so useful in my mind that I can use sliders and some presets to more quickly accomplish things that would otherwise be a much more laborious process. And one of the things I use is Raya Pro, which is a tool both for blending multiple exposures and has quick and easy ways to do other things. For example, by clicking Filters and Finish, you just click Light Vignette, and presto, there's a vignette. So I'll get rid of the second vignette, but I added a little vignette just to draw the viewer's eye again to the middle. And then just a bit of surface blur, which is under, oops, excuse me, filter. I have to make it visible. Filter, blur. Here we go. Surface blur. Again, just to soften the look of the water. And you can see this is just at a 48% opacity, so it's nothing obtrusive, I hope, but just softens the overall look. This was a relatively straightforward edit, nothing too elaborate, but you can see what I'll do is I'll group the edits. So you can see now the after and the before. The after and the before. And the after is different than the before, but it represents a view of this spot as I have seen it look, perhaps not as it looked that exact day, but it did create the feel I was looking for, and that's where I ended up. So that's what I have for you. Oh, and then let me finish one more thing. The third step, so I started in Lightroom, moved to Photoshop, and now I'm going to import this back into Lightroom again for just some final cleanup. So this is how it came out of Photoshop. I create snapshots so I can track things. It's from Photoshop. And often again, Lightroom has some ideas that I might not have that could be useful. So I often start by clicking the auto button. And in this case, it seems I largely accepted it. And you can see before and after, it's brought the contrast down, it's brought the blacks down, and created a subtly more solid and centered and grounded feel to it. I'm not sure I have the right adjectives, but it was more attractive to my eye. So in this case, I didn't do anything too dramatic on the second visit to Lightroom. Sometimes I do, but you can see the green in the water has darkened up and has more definition. And at that point, I am done. So I hope that was somewhat clear, wasn't too fast. If you have any questions, please use the help link at the top of the Photo Evolution menu bar and send a question, and I will do my very best to respond to it. I will be seeing you on more of these in the future.